how do you see us overcoming the problems we are facing? And what role can the diaspora play in bringing about a more unified utopia, I guess, society we all hope and imagine for?
Elect Andom to answer because I feel like we haven't heard from you for a minute.
Yes, and I want to hear the Eritrean perspective. I think the Ethiopians are taking too much time here.
No, not at all. I mean, I'll combine this with the last question about the dam. Because from the Eritrean side, when we're looking at sort of how Isaias has played this over, let's say, the last 10 years, only recently did he shift his position on the dam. Before, he was sort of on the Egyptian side. The claims that he had made were that, it wasn't a necessity for Ethiopia, it exceeded its development needs, and that there were sort of motivations in terms of regional geopolitics of Ethiopia wanting to push Sudan and Egypt sort of out of the fray. And so I think it's interesting to see why, Isaias in mid-October is sort of changing, Eritreans are changing their tune around that. On the same trip and where he's visiting the dam, he's also visiting air bases and whatnot. Again, this is prior to the war on Tigray starting. So I think when you want to think about the ways in which Eritrea is involved in this conflict, even though, again, if you're looking at the state media, there's no actual reports coming out from Eritrea around this. There's no sort of affirmations or statements about their involvement. We see clues when we look and connect the dots. And so when we're looking at this, broadening it out from, again, geopolitics and a regional perspective, right? Eritrea doesn't have really much to lose in terms of the Ethiopian issues around the dam with Egypt, right? Eritrea still has good relationships with Egypt, as part of the Saudi UAE alliance in which Egypt is part of, and Eritrea being a sort of client state of Saudi and UAE, which themselves are client states of the West. We see this sort of tiered system working for Eritrea. It's like, all right, they can make the switch. They can agree with Abiy, and they don't lose anything from this, right? They're cool with Ethiopia. If it works out for Ethiopia, they're cool with Egypt. There's nothing. They have no issue with that. And I think connecting that with the diaspora and how we are able to engage with the regime in this way, I think it shows around what actually Eritrean interests are, and if it's able to switch in such a dramatic way, and the actual arguments that the Eritrean government was using prior around development, around trying to push regional powers. I mean, Eritrean government's fickle, right? Eritrean government is going to engage with who it wants to engage with, when it wants to engage with, because again, for them, it's about power, maintaining dominance, and again, understanding the sort of shifting tide of alliances in a region which is facing multiple conflicts, right? Whether it be the dam, whether it be what's going on in Tigray. So for the diaspora, that poses a challenge because we're dealing with a regime that has no problem, as we've already been speaking about, I know Mark was articulating before, has no problem brutalizing its people. It has no problem forming alliances with those around it, even if it's not in the interest of Eritreans, even if it's not really in the actual sort of political alignment of what the PFDJ believes is right for themselves. Because again, it all comes down to power. And so I think for us in the diaspora, that means that we need to be able to cultivate our own power that exists outside of the regime. We need to be able to construct and create a liberated future that can imagine past Isaias's however many years he has left. So like, what does an Eritrea look like without the PFDJ? One of the, I don't want to say benefits, I say it, not again minimizing what the diaspora and the refugees and migrants struggled through, but because we have so many people in the diaspora throughout the West, all over the world, we just have a lot of skills and power and influence to be able to effectuate change, whether it be, as Samuel was talking about before, contacting members of Congress, contacting elected leaders. We see in New Zealand, right? We now have a member of parliament there. So I think it's about us recognizing the power that we have in the diaspora, because for our brothers, sisters, cousins back home, right, they can't take that risk, right? We know what's going to be facing them if they do something. And so for us, I think it's about being able to build that power. I think even something like a conversation like this, but amongst Eritreans, Ethiopians coming together, is something that is important, particularly for us who are first or second generation, because our parents' generation, those who are part of EPLF, TPLF, whatever revolutionary group we want to talk about, back in the 60s, 70s, this is our fight that we need to be able to usher into the next generation. So I think the ways in which we can build power here in the West, I think that's going to be really important. Some of it can happen electorally through actually what goes on in our own countries. But I think building power, creating organizations that can actually challenge the regime and exist outside the influence of the regime is going to be really, really important for us. And I think we're doing a decent job of it. There's a lot of cynicism and there's a lot of despondency around it because it's difficult to liberate a place that you can't actually set foot in and have actually foot soldiers on the ground. But that's our challenge, that's our struggle, and we just got to push forward on with it.
Very well said. I'm gonna keep mine really short too, because a lot of it is basically what Andom just said. I think in the diaspora we've always had like dreams of Africa unite. You know what I'm saying? Like the Bob Marley song and whatnot, right? And I think the fact that we were talking about, you talked about the 3 Ws, the water, waste, Wi-Fi. Like we're in America. You know what I'm saying? And so like if us in the diaspora cannot like mimic what we want our home countries to look like, then I feel like that kind of lowers the hope, a little bit. So I think us with all the access and potential that we have, we should be able to mimic how we want the governments to operate back home and be able to focus on the fundamental issues that do affect us all. Like Andom said, like Makta brought up in the question, the dam, that's something that could positively benefit the whole entire Horn, right? Electricity and all that good stuff. Yeah, I think focusing on what things our government should be focusing on back home and figuring out ways to bring attention to that, because like Andom said, also the voices out there are pretty much voiceless, especially at times like these. Yeah, that's pretty much all I gotta say.
I just want to jump in real quick again with one other final statement that I was thinking about as you were talking of, and Ayanta, you were mentioning this a little bit before around the discourse, but I also think those of us in the diaspora, we shouldn't be afraid to show solidarity with people outside of our country, outside of our ethnic group. In fact, I wouldn't even say shouldn't be afraid. It should be our imperative to do so, especially when we see injustice. But I think because the conversation can be so toxic, obviously, you want to just recognize your privilege and position. But I just think it's so important for us to, when we see injustice, to call it out. And it's also to call out people who are saying that we're acting on behalf of, I can't tell you the number of things that I've heard just in the last month of organizations and people that I am acting out on behalf of for, even Sam, bro, after we had our live, man, the DMs were really interesting, but, and I know you deal with that a lot. And I know, everyone throughout the region deals with it a lot, but we have to be, really just unafraid and unabashed in calling that out. And maybe even more so when it's not people who are that they perceive us to be aligned with ethnically. Like I had people telling me, saying like, oh, you don't care when there's killings of Amharas or Oromos. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, just because you're not necessarily like stalking what I'm posting, or like, how are you able to say that because I maybe take a certain position on what's happening right now in Ethiopia? So that was really, really interesting to me. And I'm hopeful that we can, particularly those of us in the West and the diaspora, can show more solidarity, especially when we're seeing injustice and human rights violations happening.
I can jump in. I echo everything that you guys said. And I think what Andom, you were saying, some of the political organizations already happening, even though you feel like, Eritrea is far away and you can't actually do stuff on the ground. But I think what we can learn from what happened in Ethiopia is that the moment could come in ways that, you never imagined. I mean, I'm not predicting anything, but when it does come, like, honestly, Ethiopia was not ready for it. At least some of the, organizations that were abroad had some base back home, but what they weren't ready even to imagine what type of demands to put forward to Abiy, Prime Minister Abiy, when he came, because they just accepted, okay, you'll lead us to the transition. Whereas in Sudan, we've seen a slightly different approach. They were like, no, we're not going to trust any military person. So I think just preparing for that moment when it comes, and what types of demands or even sort of approaches that the stakeholders would ask for, I think is so critical. And I think the tone, also you just hinted at it, the diaspora is part of the problem as well, not just the solution. I think a lot of the polarization in Ethiopia is actually driven. I mean, just think about where the sources of information are for Ethiopians and Eritreans. Not a lot of media on the ground. A lot of it is also coming from abroad. And so what are we saying to each other? How are we saying them to each other? I think that has a big role to play in terms of where we arrived. For the diaspora media here based out of BC has done a lot of messaging that is contributing to what's happening in Tigray right now. And the same can be said about the government media too, but the diaspora is a big part of it. So I think just how do we change the conversation, make it productive, make it somewhat of like empathetic, like Ayanta was saying, like we have lost that. And I think that could be a big role. And final thing is just outside of the political space, I think the diaspora could actually just work on skills for young people in Eritrea and Ethiopia. I'm ultimately, this is about them. I mean, ultimately it is about, like you were saying, having access to things so that they can improve their skills and have a better life ultimately. So how can we use the skills that we already have here? And it's not impossible, having engaged with like some projects before, it's not impossible to actually galvanize the type of money and sort of skills and use the whatever resources, internet and whatever, to empower people, empower not in a condescending way, but really give them the skills they need to be better, be better skilled people and also just ask the right questions. Even having forums like this, I don't know, I feel like that's the work, that's the hard work that needs to be done. And it's going to take a while, but I think we have the privileges that we can pull to help contribute that way and neutralize some of the damage we're creating already. So yeah, that's my
point. So of the diaspora, well, first of all, we should say diasporas, because as someone who's been part of Oromo diaspora activism, I've been in this space for almost 10 years now, and the one thing that I noticed is that whenever Oromos are pushing for whenever they're demanding change, there's always a group that's countering them. And I'm not just talking about government cadres or those people who are directly benefiting from the status quo. I'm just talking about just people on the internet.
I know who you're talking about.
But also, and so this has been like a continuous thing, right? And now I'm watching as Tigray activists are calling out the war. There's another group that's standing against that call and saying the opposite. And I think our contradictions because when we come to the diaspora, what do? We bring our contradictions, we bring our marginalities and privileges and positionalities, because for instance, the American Congress is so sick of dealing with the Ethiopian diaspora, because one group of people will write a letter and say, this war is excellent, we're trying to get rid of this junta and you should support it. And then you have another group that's like, our families are being destroyed, this war is horrible. So these contradictions, we're a hot mess as a diaspora because we haven't, again, addressed the root cause. I think that because we have the space to have these conversations, and because we have some privileges, we could be doing the harder work, especially because, as we saw in 2018, the diaspora may not be boots on the ground protesting and all of that, but when it comes down to it, it has a lot of influence. I have mixed feelings about that, but could we have a different kind of diaspora organizing? Could we have a more principle-based? Because we've seen alliances made and fail. between different groups. You know, you have groups who work together to bring down the TPLF, EPRDF. Now you have groups who are working together to bring down Abiy. And I'm sure it's the same, you know, in the Eritrean situation, or maybe it's different, I'm not sure. But this kind of like, it's also, I think, maybe generational. Like, personally, I'm not interested in being a politician. Like, I'm never going to join a political party. Like, I'm interested in this space because I fundamentally believe that there's an injustice, and I'm connected to that. And I feel like I can be an actor in that, you know, as I work with other people, not necessarily because I think that I'll get something out of it personally. So there's no reason why I shouldn't do what Andom is saying, which is to recognize that injustice is occurring across different groups and that different people are suffering, and to call it out and to be in solidarity. So I hope that that generational difference, especially for those of us who are younger in the diaspora and who are not interested in, you know, who are not like running a political party, should be easier, at least in theory, I think.
I think, you know, just to sort of respond to what people said and add on to it, you know, Ayantu, you mentioned a really interesting point. You know, there are a lot, especially sort of the those that are sort of from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s generation of folks that are in the diaspora. Many of them do sort of have this aspiration of going to Ethiopia and running the country or whatever. I mean, we saw this in the 2005 elections. You know, you had a lot of folks that you know, went back a year or so before the elections and set up political parties, and you know, that really only had real power base in urban areas, but had set up political parties and thought they were going to take over the country, and were more interested in regime change than they were interested in actual building of institutions and building of opportunity and access. And so, you know, I think, you know, the diaspora is, you know, definitely not a monolithic entity, whether it's the Eritrean or the Ethiopian diaspora or the African diaspora as a whole. I think it is incredibly layered. In some respects, it is very problematic. I think the diaspora is very toxic, but I also think that the diaspora plays a very important role, a helpful role. I mean, I don't know what the remittance numbers are for Eritrea, but I mean, Ethiopian diaspora remits billions of dollars to Ethiopia. Yeah, and you think about, I remember like a decade or so ago, there was a report for one of the G conferences, I think it was the G8 or G20 or whatever, and the African diaspora as a whole sits on over $50 billion of assets. That was over a decade ago. I'm sure the number is higher now. And so there are a lot of great things, you know, even to Mastash's point, that the diaspora can provide technical expertise. I mean, there are so many, I mean, just even in our networks, how many Eritreans and Ethiopians do we know who are exceptionally successful in their fields, and you know, they're leading hospitals, and they're elected officials, and they're running for office, and they're investors, and you know, they're doing their thing in different spheres. We have Eritreans and Ethiopians who are athletes and business executives and artists and all sorts of other things in the diaspora. And not just, you know, the sort of the well-known ones. I mean, all of us have something to contribute. And so I think, you know, there is a real sort of technical skills transfer that can be done. There's a question as to access, you know, whether it's the Eritrea or Ethiopia, just in terms of, you know, are there channels for the diaspora to contribute, you know, especially, you know, when you think about repressive governments and sort of how they may view or treat the diaspora, that's an issue. I agree that, you know, especially sort of politically, we're not coherent. And so, yeah, that is true. I mean, Congress is, you know, they're annoyed by us. I mean, just frankly, and you know, I've been in numerous meetings over the last few weeks with congressional folks, and just the level of confusion and toxicity, and just sort of how fed up they are with Ethiopians is definitely a true statement. But I think to the point, you know, that you mentioned, I think part of this is there's a real lack of creating principled alliances. You know, sort of what is it that you believe at the core, and that issue, whatever it is that you believe in, how do you bring people together around that, even if they have different opinions, or even if there may be generational trauma or whatever. I think one of the really interesting things that we are seeing now with this war on Tigray is there are Oromos, Tigrayans, and Eritreans that are sort of stepping up together and saying, we are condemning this. You know, you're seeing these protests all over the world now, especially in different national capitals, where you will see the OLF flag with the Tegaru flag, with the Eritrean flag, and with, you know, whatever host country flag there is, and it's like, wow, you know, in what world? I mean, I never would have expected, especially sort of the Tigrayan and OLF flags, to be sort of together. That was always sort of a weird thing. I mean, it reminded me sort of 2018 when you saw the Eritrean and Ethiopian flags hoisted up together in Asmara and in Addis Ababa. I was like, wow, like in what world are we living in? But you know, politics makes for strange bedfellows, and I think it's important to sort of create strategic alliances around what are the actual goals here. And if the goal is to support and preserve and promote a multinational Ethiopia that is truly inclusive, that is democratic, that is economically just, and that is something that is forward-looking, then those people, regardless of their ethnicity or religion or past misgivings, who believe in that, do need to coalesce and need to do that. I mean, I think, you know, to Andom's point, you know, and we talked about this with our live, and the DMs that I get in the emails. But I mean, this isn't new. I mean, I've been doing this for 15 years. I mean, there have been numerous rumors and insults my way. I mean, I think you don't get into activism, you don't get into politics unless you have thick skin, and you know, because otherwise this stuff will eat you up and you will not be able to sleep at night. And part of it also is, you know, just never read comments, never read anything that anyone has to say about you, because oftentimes these are armchair generals, these are internet warriors who they hide behind fake screen names and just say whatever, but in reality would never have the guts to confront you. So part of this is also, you know, we have to realize, you know, this whole whataboutism culture that we have, and, you know, to the point, you know, speaking out against the injustice that Tigrayans are facing, or the Oromos, whatever. It's like, well, what about this, or what about that? And it's like, okay, and then we start going down this rabbit hole of oppression Olympics, which is, again, I tried to allude to it earlier. I mean, you know, you look at Ethiopian history, you look at African history. At one point we were all oppressed, at one point we were all oppressors, and let's start looking towards solutions and stop playing like the, well, you know, you did this to me 200 years ago, so I'm not going to support you in your cause today. And if we keep staying in that bubble, then, I mean, yeah, like if I look, you know, long enough in history, I'm sure there's some Oromo warlord that murdered Tigrayans back in the day. I'm sure there is. So am I going to sit around here and say, well, I'm perfectly fine with what Abi's doing in Oromia? Like, no, like you can't continue to sort of relitigate the past. You have to look forward. And so I think that, you know, the diaspora needs to sort of be forward looking in this way, needs to emulate the sort of culture that we would like to see on the continent. You know, there are some who do that very well, and then there are others who actually, again, contribute to the toxicity. But again, with the GERD, for instance, with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, part of the beauty of this, I mean, I swear, GERD is one of the only good things about Ethiopia right now, it's a completely Ethiopian financed project. The diaspora poured in money, the Ethiopian people in Ethiopia, I mean, whether you're at home or abroad, people poured in millions of dollars into this $5 billion project. And so, yes, along the way, was it controversial? Yes. Yes, along the way, did the military industrial complex in Ethiopia contribute to some questionable spending and potential corruption? Sure, yes, we can go down that. But at the end of the day, it manifests a vision that Ethiopians have held not just for decades, but really for centuries, to sort of utilize the Nile River and how to do that. And of course, are there geopolitical implications to it? Of course. I mean, one of the reasons why the Egyptians really hate Ethiopia is because Meles laid the cornerstone to the GERD when Egypt was experiencing the Arab Spring, and it was a perfect opportunity to launch what was Project X. You know, it was a perfect opportunity. So does Egypt, for instance, stand to benefit from the instability of Ethiopia and the potential disintegration of Ethiopia? Then of course, yes. So you know, you think about the first question that we were all asked. I mean, there are numerous state and non-state actors who seek to benefit from this, including members of the Ethiopian diaspora who may seek to benefit from the fragmentation of Ethiopia or the extermination of a particular identity. And so, I mean, we have to be willing to call people out. We need to be able to call people out on their bullshit, if I can be very, you know, blunt on that. But also we need to be able to emulate the sort of the sort of expectations that we see for Ethiopia or for Eritrea among ourselves first and foremost, and to be better organized and be better strategic about it is going to be critical. So I mean, one thing that I've been doing over the last few weeks in particular is I've become more acquainted with other Ethiopians who sort of share this sort of view of perfecting the federation and how to do that. And you know, we've been sharing notes and comparing experiences and learning from each other. And I think that's been really helpful, especially sort of when you look at the digital activism of Oromos over the last 4 years, 5 years. I mean, obviously their numbers are far larger than Tigrayans, but there are certainly lessons that can be learned. And never mind that a lot of Oromos are now retweeting Tagaro activists as well. And so there's certainly an alliance that has been formed sort of naturally, because we know what this war is truly about. This is not about some law enforcement operation. This is not about eliminating the TPLF junta. I mean, and if it truly was, it's a whole lot of effort to capture 50 people, you know, putting collective punishment. And so these are some of the things that we just need to sort of be aware of. And it concerns me that there are a lot of people, including, you know, rather well-educated people, to Andom's point, that we know that we may sort of respect or may have respected before November 3rd, who are perfectly fine with what's going on right now and will actually go to extreme lengths to defend it. And I mean, you know, if you're Western educated, just sitting down and forcefully advocating for such a barbaric war, it's just the cognitive dissonance that, I mean, I don't know how to articulate it. And, you know, and my thing has always been, look, if you're for this war, you know, buy a ticket, go to the battlefront and fight it yourself, because, you know, no one stands to benefit from this. And we've seen this, even the sort of the unleashing of decades old tensions between Amharas and Tigrayans over lands, you know, in the Welkite area. I mean, like this is stuff that has been sort of canned for a while, and instead of serving as a peacemaker, Abiy has just exacerbated this. And again, even in the southern region right now, there's conflicts that have led to about 130 people being displaced over the last 3-4 weeks, but no one's talking about it. And so there's just so much that's going on in Ethiopia, in addition to the other crises of COVID-19, locusts, chronic food insecurity, youth unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. You add on all the ethno-religious political crises, constitutional crisis, on top with the sort of natural and human made disasters. It's just, it poses a very explosive situation. And I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but we do have to be realistic about sort of what path Ethiopia is going on right now. And it is incumbent upon the diaspora, the Eritrean and Ethiopian diaspora, to really denounce things, but also to serve as a source of information, as a source of knowledge, as a source of empowerment. And part of that job for us as Eritreans and Ethiopians is to tell stories. You know, we have the privilege of being here. We are away from these autocrats and their reach. And so we can speak freely and we can speak publicly. We speak English, we are articulate. We have our own connections and our own competencies. And so being able to tell the stories is very important. So I hope we can continue to do that.